So our next speaker is Kerri Waters. Kerri has been the political and research lead at Animal Rebellion since 2019. She is currently preparing to start a PhD researching how to transition farmers away from animal farming by building relationships with the farming community with the goal to move towards a world where animals can live freely. In her presentation, Kerri outlines opportunities that the reality of today's meat and dairy industry offers to animal rights activists in achieving our goals collaboratively with people who have previously been a roadblock to progress. She will describe how her work in Animal Rebellion and other rights organizations has built relationships with movements and individuals that have radically different values but provide avenues for positive outcomes for animals. So please welcome Kerri Waters.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the organisers. It's a miracle that we're here and we're putting it on, considering that we're in the middle of a global pandemic. And just to see so many of you here, it's great. So my name is Kerri Waters. I'm a PhD researcher at Viva, and I'm going to talk to you about how we can build alliances with farmers and the journey that I went on to get to that point. But first of all, I'd like to just take the time to recognise an individual who resisted right to the end, who sadly this week lost his life. This is Geronimo, the alpaca. Geronimo was killed by the UK government this week because they say he supposedly has tuberculosis. But Geronimo is just a symbol of the UK government's failed attempt to eradicate tuberculosis, which is the cause of it is due to farming animals, because they blame badgers and other animals. So I'd like to just take a moment to a minute's silence just to acknowledge Geronimo and all the other animals on the land, in the air and the sea who resist every day. So let's just take a minute's silence. So I think it's safe to assume that most of us here are vegans, animal rights activists. Don't worry, I'm not going to out you if you're not. So most of us would have spent a significant part of our lives eating, exploiting animals. I'd like you to just remember back to that period before you went vegan, before you stopped seeing animals as commodities. What did you think of veganism? Well, weird is one word I would use to describe my thoughts. What did you think of animal rights activists? Well, militant is the word that comes to mind for me. In the English language, militant is synonymous with extremist, terrorist even. I'd like you just to hold that thought in your mind, and we'll come back to it at the end of my presentation. So for me, this is my little furry companion, Rufus, and he was the reason why I went vegan. He was my inspiration. At that time, I had no intention of becoming an activist. So what happened? Well, to borrow a meme, this is how it started. And this is how it's going. It turned into the very thing that I thought was weird. And in between was a little bit of this. I don't think that I'm ever going to live down the fact that I was on UK morning television next to a man dressed as a giant broccoli, no matter what I do in my life. So I was pulled into this strange world when I met Dora Hartigay, Dan Kidby, and Dr. Alex Lockwood to help set up Animal Rebellion 2 years ago. Animal Rebellion is an offshoot of Extinction Rebellion focused on the impact of farming animals on climate crisis. They focus on system change rather than individual change. And one of our strategic aims was to shift the wider environmental and social justice movements to be talking about the problems that eating animals has on society. Now, to borrow a phrase from the ticking tenure clock by Blair French, animal activists are seen as orphans of the left. In the UK, while many groups such as gay rights groups, Black rights groups talk about solidarity with each other, the progressive left often leaves out the exploitation of other species. They do this because they often see animal rights as a direct challenge to human dignity, a dehumanization, if you will. And this isn't unfounded. In the past, and continuing to today, many groups have been used the speciesist form of animalization to justify their discrimination, prejudice, and denying their rights by force. So our task in Animal Rebellion was gargantuan. We wanted to position animal rights, animal farming as a social justice issue, while also persuading the animal movement to move towards more of a systemic change model rather than just individual change. And as a member of the movement of movements, a loose coalition of different groups who all shared the same goal of combating the climate crisis, we would often have discussions that were infuriating, that felt like, quite frankly, to borrow an English idiom, like banging your head against a brick wall. However, as animal activists, we are responsible for building movement capacity. With no way that we will reach that critical mass of activists if we keep operating within our own silos, within our own groups. In Hegemony How To, a roadmap for radicals, Jonathan Smucker shows how we need to shift the spectrum of support. We need to influence leaders, groups, social bases, institutions towards our goal, to move them slightly towards us so that we can gain a larger percentage of society to get involved with animal rights. Smucker says, powerful political challengers have never built their operations entirely from scratch, but rather by means of politicizing, activating, and aligning existing social blocks and institutions. He talks about how this seed work, as he calls it, means going into other groups' spaces, going to their events, moving beyond promoting just our own actions. And as the political coordinator for Animal Rebellion, I did just this on a local level. In my hometown, I went to different events, LGBTQ rights events, BLM events, trade union events. I showed solidarity where I could. I showed support. I offered as much help as possible. And in the end, this meant that as Animal Rebellion, we were able to give 3 large speeches to crowds of hundreds who usually wouldn't be receptive or either hear an animal rights messaging. Last year, I was invited to take part in Extinction Rebellion Strategy Assembly. Now, Extinction Rebellion have notoriously been quite hostile to talking about animal agriculture. Together with my colleague Marina, we spent time to build relationships with the other members to find out what their causes were, what their hopes, dreams, or what their journeys were. And after we'd built those links, we then introduced the idea of speciesism. We showed how you can put a strong anti-speciesist messaging into a strategy. And that's exactly what happened. In Extinction Rebellion's 2021 strategy, they talk about the problems of speciesism alongside other forms of discrimination. And once this happened, the dominoes started to fall. When we did our biggest action to date, when we blockaded all 4 McDonald's distribution centres in the UK and cut off the supply for days and shut down some restaurants, many of the activists who took part were from Extinction Rebellion. Some weren't even vegan or vegetarian, but they were willing to put themselves on the line for an animal rights action. Some of them have even gone vegan because of it. After that, we can see that today there's a rebellion happening at this very moment in London. Animal rebellion is at the heart and centre of it. Extinction Rebellion's messaging has shifted to talking about animal agriculture. We've achieved that strategic milestone. But throughout all this experience, the one thing that really piqued my interest, that really grabbed me, was working with farmers. Because I love a challenge. And so I started to see how transformational gaining the support of the very people doing the thing that we were campaigning against can be. The first time I saw this was when Extinction Rebellion put out a video showing calves taken from their mothers, chained up in hutches. And an XR member, a farmer, was very angry about this, said that not all farmers are the same, not all farming is like that, that's wrong. So I reached out to them. I tried to find the common ground. We had common ground with the environmental movement, but also I found out that she had hopes and fears for her children. She just wanted to build a better world. And in the end, after going to visit this farmer and trying to build a relationship, I received this message that I'll never forget. This message may seem like a very small little thing, but what it's done is plant a seed. It opened up a new perspective for her husband who was resistant, but she was the one who wanted to move towards more sustainable forms of agriculture, away from using animals. This is when I gained the confidence to start talking to more farmers. During a rebellion, I debated a sheep farmer outside the BBC. I then was asked to go on to different podcasts. I was interviewed on a really prominent dairy podcast in the UK. Also during a rebellion, we refused to leave the XR farmers' camp in a show of solidarity due to police repression. I linked up with other groups such as Refarmed or the Ranchers Advocacy Project, who were also trying to transform farmers. I also helped support Save British Farming by organising a protest, and this was the first time in the UK that animal rights activists had protested with farmers at Westminster. And you can see the lovely fruit and veggie costumes there. We also managed to gain significant press in the farmers' newspapers. So you see, if we could go to the actual source of animal exploitation and help them stop it, then logically, for me, that feels like the best form of my activism. You think it's an impossible task? Well, maybe it is, but there are reasons why this moment in history is probably the best chance we've ever had to end the industry. And I'm going to go into a few reasons why, 5 reasons why this is true. So the first is profitability. Now, many of these examples are UK based, but They exist across the Western world. So most farmers don't make money from actual farming. In the UK, up to 90% of farmers' income comes from subsidies. And the problem with that is that as we've Brexited, our agricultural system is going through a reform. Farmers will not be paid subsidies in 2024. It's going to be phased out and replaced by environmental-based subsidies, which you might think, great, that's fantastic. However, these environmental initiatives involve things such as investing in more technology, genetically modifying animals, things that really farmers, small-scale farmers, aren't in a place to invest in, and things that aren't helpful at all for us or animals. Secondly, there's a downward pressure from the retailers and producers to constantly push down prices at the farm gate. This is particularly seen in dairy, where the price of milk has steadily decreased over the years. Alongside this is increased production costs. As new technology rises, as new animal welfare and environmental policies come into place, farmers are forced to either, and in the words of one farmer who told me, go big or go home. They just aren't in a position to be able to carry on. And then there's the impact of the pandemic. In the UK, for example, there's been a loss of export markets. One abattoir in particular in my hometown has now gone down to a 3-day working week because they lost the Chinese market. All in all, animal farming is losing its profitability and has been for many years. And this can be seen in this graph from the UK. Now you can see in the 1990s, profits fell drastically, and that was due mainly to the BSE crisis. But these profits haven't recovered very much. For example, between 2017 and 2018, it fell by 17%, and 14% of UK farms failed to make profit in that period. And as you can see from this graph, today, profits are nowhere near what they used to be in the 1970s. Secondly, the industrialization of farming. This is not a good news for small-scale farmers. Now, over 90% of farmed animals globally are living in factory farms at present, according to the Sentience Institute. And that's not just not happening in the USA, that's also happening in the UK and Europe. Since 2003, the UK government has given permits to over 1,700 intensive poultry and pig farms. And these US-style mega farms, for example, where calves never see the light of day and are kept in sheds, there are 800 of them now in the UK. Farmers sit much more upstream in the supply chain. And what we mean by that is that these big conglomerates, these big agricultural corporations, they make farmers vulnerable because they own most of the chain of production. What these companies demand, farmers have to do. Now, farm size is a good indication of this. What we can see here, for example, is that in the UK, many, many years ago, the average farm size was much smaller. There were 9 times as many small farms in the UK as there are today. But during that period, the average size of herds has increased. So we have much larger farms and much larger herds. And comparing this to Europe also gives the similar picture. Almost 3/4 of what Europe defines as livestock units were raised on the largest farms. It appears more intensive farming practices are increasing, and the number of animals living on smaller or medium-sized farms has dropped by more than a half in recent years. This is due to these big conglomerates, as I say. Many of you will know the names like JBS and Cargill, mainly because they're responsible for deforestation in the Amazon. But they also have subsidiaries. They operate in other countries under different names, so you'd be mistaken. For example, in the UK, JBS's Pilgrim's Pride makes up more than 30% of the pig meat market. It has 15 production factories across the UK and kills 1.5 million pigs per year. These corporations force small-scale farmers to either leave the industry or consolidate their lands and work for them. Thirdly, and I won't go too much into this because I think we already know the impact of animal farming on the climate. The modern farm is a matter of grave intersector policy concern. I like this quote because this is the crux of the issue here. Farms and farming, animal farming, is inefficient, it's bad for the environment, and it's bad for animals. One of my quotes that I use quite often is that livestock takes up nearly 80% of global agricultural land, yet produces only 20% of the world's calories. There are other better ways we can use to feed the world. And that's why farming is in crisis. And this graph just shows you exactly what I mean. Fourthly, the emergence of alternative proteins, cell-based meat, and changing diets is causing huge disruption to the animal farming industry. When we have organizations like the World Health Organization telling people that they should select prominently plant-based diets, when we see that the plant-based food market is growing exponentially, it's estimated to grow by 11.9% by 2027 and be valued at 74.2 billion. Jim Mellon, who authored the fantastic book Moore's Law, he predicts that cell-based meats will reach price parity in the next 5 years. At that point, there's no justification for farming animals. And similarly, Rethink X predicts that the meat and dairy industries will collapse by 2030. This is happening now. Farmers know it's happening now. And then lastly, you have the reality of being an animal farmer. A great vegan activist, Dr. Alice Brough, an ex-pig farmer, recently gave an excellent talk at the Vegan Camp out in the UK. She talked about the prevalence of mental health problems with the farmers she encountered in the industry, problems of post-traumatic stress disorder, the rates of suicide in the UK that are twice the average, and the violence that exists. There's also a lack of new entrants in the industry. What young people would want to go into this is the question. The financial hardship we've already recovered, and the lack of diversity and opportunities that exist. Now, if this is inevitable, if the farming industry is collapsing, why should we help farmers? At the end of the day, they are the oppressors. Well, personally, this is a quote I've always liked from Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was an abolitionist in the anti-slavery movement, and he received a lot of criticism from other abolitionists because he would enter into dialogue with slave owners. And when he was criticized, his response was, "I would unite with anybody to do right and with nobody to do wrong." And this is something that I try to hold when I'm outreaching to other groups. But on a more practical level, farmers can really help give legitimacy to our cause. So this is a quote by Dr. Alex Lockwood, who's an animal rights scholar and professor. "The efficacy of the message is hugely dependent on the trustworthiness and acceptance of the messenger. For example, In the UK, the government department DEFRA funds new farmer cluster collaboratives, where farmers share advice on how to farm more sustainably, as it is more effective than top-down government communication. And it is why ex-farmers, who are now vegans, are a holy grail in so many campaigning and advocacy materials or films. From a social, psychological perspective, we align ourselves with the groups we believe we are in or a part of, and we want to continue to belong to those groups. So we trust messengers from those groups or certain individuals. David Attenborough springs to mind, who has high trust value across social groups. The messenger really matters, almost more so than the message. And going back to the book, Hegemony How To, the author there talks about how we need to take the narrative from these groups. He gave an example of during the Stop the War protests in the USA, he organized an action where he took veterans of the Vietnam War and they went in their uniform and they protested. Now that just gave legitimacy to the cause. You can't ignore a veteran who's telling you this, just like you can't ignore a farmer who's telling you to stop eating animals. So what would it practically look like to bring about a plant-based food system? And what would it take to get farmers there? That's the question I asked myself. So I decided to embark on a PhD. And I will take a cross-section of 30 UK farmers and use a mixture of participant observation and semi-structured interviews to study how these farmers interact with their work, with the farm, with the animals, with the wider industry. I want to find out exactly what are the social, economic, cultural, and technological networks that they have. From these results, I want to help provide an insight into how best to effectuate change and how we can, as activists, outreach to farmers to get them to explore other alternatives. And this is where Viva comes in. So I approached Juliette Gallatley, the founder, and she was very enthusiastic about the project. Viva are the UK's biggest animal rights charity, and they do a lot of high-profile undercover investigations. So as I expressed, I strongly believe in working with other groups, and even working with other groups in our movement. I think it's always interesting to find out what other theories of change they have and to really get on board as an ecology of movements. So hopefully I'll be able to come back with the results of my study and a plan that we have to inform government policy and also to help these farmers transition to alternative forms. So going back to the question that I posed to you at the beginning, do you remember how you thought before you were vegan, before you were an animal rights activist? So many of these farmers have been born into this system. They are generations after generations after generations. They don't see an option to leave. Tradition and finances dictate what they do. When it comes to this, they are, in essence, like us. The animal will always be the first victim here, but are farmers not victims too? Were we also not victims to these abhorrent practices that were forced on us from birth? As a movement, we're very good at empathizing with other creatures, but we also are in a great position to extend that empathy to our fellow human beings. Because as the saying goes, none of us are free until all of us are free. So let's change this narrative of us versus them that the media really likes to put across when it comes to farmers and vegan activists. Let's make the most unlikeliest of allies with us to create a better world for all. Thank you, and I'll take any questions.
Thank you for your presentation, Kerri.
Thank you.
So once again, if you're joining us online, you have the opportunity to write down any questions you may have in the Q&A feature, and I will read it out for you. Are there any questions here in this room so far? Okay, let me just check online. All right, so we have one question. Do you notice long-term change in the minds of farmers, the very people whose revenues and maybe a long family tradition rely on the exploitation of animals, or is it just a short-term emotional reaction if they show understanding in the interaction with you?
I think even short-term understandings will plant that seed. On a more long-term perspective, and this is why I'm doing this PhD, I think it's important for us to understand the industry itself and also to understand why it is farmers are stuck there. They have an identity, and that identity is providing food. And what we need to do is replace that identity, not necessarily to say that they can't provide food, just that they can't do that exploiting animals. And it also doesn't mean that they can't be guardians of these animals. One of the things that I'd really like to explore is how can farmers reassess their relationship with non-human animals? So would that mean having a sanctuary-based system, for example, getting the government to provide subsidies for protecting these animals? So I think even if you spark an interest that's fleeting in a farmer, changing that stereotype, like I was talking about, how people outside of our movement think we're a little bit weird or extremist, just changing that stereotype can go a long way.